If you show that the story is aware of how it's being played, to me that's a living story. And that's the difference between not just taking a non-linear game that's happy being non-linear because it wants to tell a certain story, but then adding in just a bit of tonal variation which shows that even if you still get to the same endpoint, it's a game which still asks you, are you playing this in a way that tells me something about you? Say, for example, okay, so I don't even mean that this is exclusively about games that do have choice in them. You can take an entirely non-linear game with no choice more sophisticated than who to shoot next. I love those games. I have no problem with those. And you can still do this effect in an entirely non-linear game. This is Max Payne 3. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that your protagonist is a badass, right? That's a fairly common trope in games. But when they first reveal themselves to be a badass on camera, how do they react to it? Are they surprised by their own badassery? Usually not, because badasses tend to know that they're badasses. But how about the people around you? Do they react? Or do they not react and just, you're just a badass? If they don't react to you being a badass, then that might tell us something about them. Or it might just mean that you're missing the opportunity to tell us something about them. If you, like in an opening sequence of Max Payne 3, you slide down a roof and with a single bullet you kill a guy who's holding a hostage, it's an amazing shot, nobody actually reacts to it, which tells us a bit about people, that they expected you to be this much of a badass. But we could tell you a lot more by having them react a little bit more. More to the point in Max Payne 3, the cutscenes tell you that you are a slightly pathetic, drug-addled washer, basically. And although, the drug effect fucks with the screen a little bit, and there's some interesting ways it plays around with it, gameplay-wise, you're so hyper-competent that there's a little bit of a disconnect there, because you're an incredibly good, you're really good at shooting, and you're a tank, you're a space marine, you absorb all these bullets. And it's an action game, that's fine. But it's a game in which you're being told that you are losing your grip on things, and in fact you're never really out of control, until it does its nice disempowerment moment. Because it has a disempowerment moment where you're in the favela, and you've lost your gun, and more to the point, the environment, there's lots of storytelling elements, visual elements, dialogue elements, that all conspire to tell you that you really are this lumbering, clumsy, drug-addled, slightly ridiculous gringo that the rest of the game has been trying to tell you that you are. It's a really great moment of disempowerment because it's sort of a companion piece to the bit in Uncharted 2 where you walk through the Nepali village. If anyone's played Uncharted 2, there's a moment where you wake up, you've got no guns, you walk through a Nepali village. It's not an action sequence. It forces you to walk. You can't even sprint. And you purely take in the scenery. And it's a really nice moment. This is very similar, but it's about feeling vulnerable. It's not about peaceful moments. But it forces you to walk. You have no gun. You go up to people and you talk to them, and they basically spit in your face and tell you to go away. And it's a really great moment of disempowerment where even though it's purely linear, you haven't chosen to be in this situation, the game still acts and responds to the way you're playing the game. Even though the game is actually forcing you to play it this way, it's still very responsive because the way that you're playing the game suddenly, in this very disempowered, slow, no-gun kind of way, is really nicely responded to because it shows you, oh, you're playing the game this way. This is about you being disempowered. You can't just fulfill this by doing your third act, player character gets knocked on the back of the head, their weapons get taken away, they're in a cage and then they have to escape. That classic disempowerment moment, it's not just about that, because that usually is just an opportunity to show that your player character is a badass even when they don't have any weapons. And you still throw the same problems at your player, now they have to solve it without the weapons. That disempowerment moment that loads of games do is really just a difficulty hike. This is an example of where the game's forcing you to play it in a certain way, and then it's going, you're playing this game in a certain way. That's interesting. It reminds us that you're actually this very vulnerable, slightly ridiculous figure. So that's it, identify your emotional clinches. Got to keep it moving. Planning ahead and planning for the unplannable. There's not a lot of gritty detail for this. It's a philosophical question. It's a question of approach. Firstly, I would say get lots of vocal options. I slightly made fun of that script earlier on with lots of that stuff is gold. Because I do the voice direction as well, and I always make sure, if you've got 5 minutes at the end of the session, don't let the actor off. Just get a load of emotional stuff out. It's always useful, because often it doesn't even need to be localized, which is really useful. It does often need to be localized, and that shouldn't be taken lightly at all. But once you have those vocal options, you can fill a lot of gaps with them. Because stories iterate, and if you have a moment in your story and you find out the punchline is dropping a little bit dead, you can actually often make up for it by just adding in that crucial So you just do a general load of emotional stuff, and it really, really pays off. Secondly, componentize your dialogue. The point here is that if I've persuaded you that even if you're doing a fairly straightforward action game, but you want to add in a little bit of this reactivity, you do need to learn from what RPGs do a little bit in order to not spend a load of money and time on trying to get that little element of reactivity. That little element of reactivity can be achieved fairly easily if you have the right methodology, which for me includes componentizing your dialogue. If a line of dialogue is doing two things, it should probably be two lines, because otherwise you will find that something will change. Scope creep is a fact of life. You'll find that something will change and that whole line is now unusable. Whereas if you break it in half, even if it just continues straight on from one line to the next, you can find that you can come in and take something out and not have to take out something else. There's nothing more heartbreaking than a perfectly good joke, which is no longer going to work because it contains an irrelevant detail, which is now a continuity problem because something's been taken out. Because it's too late in the day and at your development cycle, it's crunch. You just have to throw out a really good joke because it refers to something as being blue, which it turns out is going to be grey. And that's nobody's fault, but it does happen. Plan what you can do with visual storytelling. This isn't like in cinema, in the cinematic economy. It's much better to do with a picture what you could do with words. And if you can do something with a picture, instead of doing it with words, brilliant. Because talk is cheap, doing a line of dialogue is almost certainly going to be cheaper than having a visual storytelling component, whether that's a pot on the floor or it's a plane that comes in and nearly cuts your head off and then it crashes or something. It's almost certainly cheaper, but visual storytelling contributes an enormous amount, so plan that out when you're doing your responsive moments. However, plan for the gaps that will appear partway through your production, because especially if you're built around your visuals, you will find that design or art are going to come to you towards the end of crunch and say, look, you're not going to be riding a giant fish, you're going to be riding a normal motorcycle. You couldn't afford the giant fish. Or it's not going to be blue, it's going to be grey. Sorry. Then you might find yourself tossing out perfectly good dialogue instead of being able to use it. So this is another way. Plan for the things that are stretch goals, the things that practically speaking are basically stretch goals, and there's always a couple of those, the things that might not be made. Now, this might be suggesting that you don't have any faith in your producers. I'm not saying that at all, but being flexible means building in the type of dialogue which is still going to be useful, even if lots of things about the scene have changed. Which is also a very useful way to keep reminding yourself to get at the emotional core of what you're trying to say and not focus on the detail. So that's planning ahead and planning for the unplannable. Again, I've really skimmed over that. There's detailed methodologies that could be applied to all of these, but I'm not going to go into those now. Flexible database-driven methodology. Now, to me, this basically means that you have a very accessible script to the point that lots of people find it a bit scary. And it means that you can make changes as easily as possible, and lots of people can make changes as easily as possible. Because everybody can spot a dialogue bug. But the bottleneck often comes up when the only person who can act on a dialogue bug quite rightly has other priorities. The dialogue bugs, especially at the end of crunch, are usually a pretty low priority. That's the way it should be. But it means that punchlines often get missed, things don't meet the quality bar, not because they weren't built with the best of intentions, but because a bug has been introduced and it just can't be fixed. You can't afford to fix it. But if you build in a methodology where lots of people can address it, that really helps. What's involved in this is keeping your dialogue like a script. Build it out of basic building blocks. So rather than having a very specific, this is the unique ID, or basically the file name for a string, so a single piece of dialogue, a single dialogue asset, a line of audio, rather than it being very specific to where it's going to be played, instead, you should be thinking about, let's keep it very general and do the rest in flags if that's the way your CMS works. Instead, the conversation, as far as the coder is concerned, should probably look something like this. The coder doesn't need to know who's speaking necessarily. Once you've built in all your tools which define what the coder is, what's going to happen when a specific person is speaking. Instead, if you approach it like this, and conversation line 3 is not working, you can just delete it. You can go in, delete it, replace it with something else, rename another file, conversation 1003. It happens seamlessly, and you don't need to go, you have to renumber every piece of dialogue in this sequence. It's not that that's not easy, but the coder may not have time to do it. Instead, if you just keep things really basic, the change can happen and the coder can automate this. So they're only going to call conversation 1. They don't care about the rest of it. It's going to play in sequence, it's just going to go. And at that point, someone who isn't the coder can just go in and say, right, we'll just take 2 out and renumber everything to be 3, 4, 5. That's fine, it'll still work. We just delete a joke that isn't working and just move on. You can process dialogue agnostically, be driven by the file name or the flag. So just like I was saying, if you approach it in terms of something that you plug in once, then code doesn't have to intervene again. It means that you can fix bugs, and you can have lots and lots of people, even down to QA, continuity error. You can pull a line out. You don't need to create a code bug. It can be done simply. And the final piece of this puzzle in order to achieve this is to, as much as this is possible, is surface to the relevant editors, which means keeping your dialogue driven by your database, the CMS, rather than having it all buried in code. I've worked with coders who would much prefer that every line of dialogue basically just had an identifying number, because it means that it can be minutely controlled. You know exactly when it's going to be played. It doesn't have to be systematized or automated. It's always in the code base. My problem with that is that then you have to go and ask them, look, 00672 isn't working. Can we refactor it so that we take out 00672 and move everything else up? That is not going to come very high on the coder's priority list for very good reason. So it's a good reason to have everything driven off a system where lots of people can go in, people who don't necessarily have the code knowledge, people you don't want to let anywhere near your code base. They can just go to the system and go, I'm just going to reorder this, yeah, export, and it goes into the runtime. It's a much, much better way to approach this. Every studio will have different ways of doing this, but that's one philosophical approach. What you should be hoping to achieve, again, this is about learning from the way that RPG studios do this, making your dialogue accessible for tweaking and bug fixing without code intervention, having easily swappable, clonable, and deletable dialogue. If you can just rename the file name, and then that changes everything, magic, because everybody can do that. And it should be easy to read. Lines should roughly say in the file name what they're going to do, even if that's just something as basic as conversation 1, because then you can index it, you know what it's going to do. It looks like a script, and that means that everyone from QA to a narrative designer to another writer, because the main writer is no longer on the project, or a designer can go in and go, okay, I guess I know what this conversation is doing. Here we go, I'm just going to edit it. This brings us back to the Wilhelm screen. It's not that it's so rich, it's so weird and slightly funny that it really sticks in your mind. You notice it whenever it comes up. But that isn't necessarily a bad thing. The reason that people still use it is because it wakes people up. It goes, you know about this. It's aware of the fact that you're aware of it, and it makes you respond, and it responds to you. And it makes you think about why it's being used, it makes you think about your favorite movie. It's a lovely piece of responsive design where a perfectly adequate screen that no one noticed would have worked perfectly well. It's not necessarily about adding more words. Sometimes it's about reusing assets and being even more efficient with your vocal assets than you thought you might be. But when you add in that element of responsive design, you can wake your players up. That's it. So, very quickly, because I often get questions about how do you get started as a game writer. This is the slide to take pictures of if you're interested in that. These are tools that you can use to make your own game. Is my advice to people who say, how do I get started as a game writer? Nowadays, what I say is, go and make a game. These are all very fine tools. They're all free, and they have great communities around them that you can use to go off and make a game without needing to know anything more than really basic logic. All linguistic logic. It's not code. It's like scripting. Full disclosure, I know people who are involved in the making of Story Next is an Inkle writer. The other one is Twine. Just Google them. These are the games that I mentioned. That's my Twitter handle and my website. And we've got a little bit of time for questions. Thank you very much. Any questions? Yo.
Hi, 2 very quick questions. One is about, are you familiar with the Kuleshov effect?
No.
Okay, so the Kuleshov effect is like in the early days of film, this guy called Kuleshov did this experiment where he showed a blank face to an audience and then put around that blank face a bunch of sort of pictures like a crying baby or a vomiting fighting man, or a man with a girl with a dagger in her eye. And of course, the audience would respond to exactly the same emotional performance from the actor in a completely different way according to the context and to the editor. So I wondered if, factored into your methodologies, you'd kind of taken into consideration the idea of context, editing, and reuse. So, for example, the idea being, if I say, I love you, but the line before it is that if you don't take that microphone away from that man, I'm going to kill him. It would be a sort of different response. So that would be kind of efficient use of
just quickly to answer that before you go to it, is to say yes. There's nothing better than just a little bit of a portentous "oh" at the end of a sentence, because the player can read into it what they want, and it's got a lot of multiplicity even though it's only one line. Similarly, like a lot of actors just throw in something without really thinking about it, and then you talk to players or people who've been to see a film, and they're like, "Oh, that was so amazing." And in fact, there's various famous cases of directors telling actors, "Just look really bored. Just look really bored at this point," and then it goes down in history as this magnificent performance. There's a specific example of that. Yes, I think that's a really good point.
So the second point, which is kind of related, is this idea of interpretation. And again, sometimes, I'm just wondering what your opinion is of non-specificity, as you talked about, but the idea that basically the work isn't really done by the database, the work really isn't done by the code, the work isn't done by the dialogue, the work isn't done by the actor, it's not done by the writer, it's done by the audience, it's in our minds, it's in our reactions. So, again, the three words "I love you" can be interpreted in all sorts of different ways according to the player's response or the audience's response. So, in a sense, sometimes writers need to be instructed to write really flatly, so that audiences can interpret it, not even context sensitive, just in terms of how they're feeling. Quite tricky to mitigate for that, and quite tricky to persuade games coders that that's important, isn't it? How do you do
I think that's another very good example. One of my favourite games that I think is brilliantly narratively designed is Limbo, which doesn't have any dialogue in. And you're open to interpret a lot of things about it. It starts off, you're a boy, very small, there's a girl, the girl is kidnapped. I've asked people who say, it's your sister, obviously. And people who say, it's some kind of girlfriend, it's building up this emotional relationship. I think that's definitely right, because you can do a lot with very little story. I go into detail about dialogue because that's what I tend to work with, but a narrative design that's nice and flexible doesn't need to involve dialogue at all and can leave a lot in the player's mind. I think you're right. Any other questions? Nope. So we've sorted narrative design, story for games, that's it, it's done. Yeah. Sorry if this sounds disgusting.
It's the question I have is I deal a lot with writers from screen, from television, who are attempting to write for games.
Yeah.
How do you manage communicating with them when they decide they want to solve, and so maybe we have an interaction that we want in a game that makes the game interactive, so there's a pace to it, and kind of we can control the players' participation so they don't get bored, with something that they would just want to solve in the edit. Like, I can actually get more character out of this without this button clicking thing. How do you manage that conversation, and how do you persuade them to consider that keeping the interactivity in is a benefit to the enjoyment of the player and them participating in the story?
Yeah, that's the eternal dilemma, and I think if you're a writer in the games industry, you definitely need to get that deeperishness out as early as possible. You know that you're going in service of the game. If you work with a professional writer who doesn't have that experience, it's not necessarily going to make your game weaker. I think, for me, my answer would be you have to have those hard conversations up front. And then you have the terms under which you can have those hard conversations as many times as you need. Because if you do have a writer who sees things a very specific way, but you've already had that conversation where you say, look, this isn't just about the story, this is about making something that's not finished, and you give it to the player and the player finishes it. It's always going to be a debate, but one way to approach it is to make sure you really have those conversations early, try and get agreement on it, and then you might have to have them again. But it's a struggle, and writers who don't respect designers, because designers are more likely to be able to spot those narrative moments. Even if they can't do Tarantino dialogue, they can do that narrative moment really, really well. More likely to be able to spot those, even if they're not writers, than a lot of screenwriters or novelists would be able to, because it's part of how games work. Can we fit one more in? Is it a very quick question? No?
Sorry.
Okay, thank you very much. If you were an aspiring game writer, I'm very happy to talk more about any of these or anything else. I'll buy you a pint because God knows it's a thankless and bloody mysterious process. If you have any further questions, just come and grab me. Thank you very much.